January 1943. Over the grey, frozen skies of occupied Europe, German radar operators picked up something strange heading toward the Ruhr industrial heartland. The formation was tight, the altitude steady, and the silhouette wasn't British. This wasn't another RAF night raid. These were Americans flying a type of aircraft German fighter pilots hadn't seen before. Twin engines, narrow fuselage, glass nose, dorsal turret. The Americans called it the B-25 Mitchell, and the Luftwaffe was about to learn just how dangerous it could be. When Luftwaffe pilots first faced the B-25, their reactions ranged from confident dismissal to stunned disbelief. But those early encounters would forever change how German airmen viewed the American bomber crews, and this, right here, is that story. At first glance, the B-25 didn't look intimidating. It wasn't as big or heavily armed as the massive B-17 Flying Fortress or the B-24 Liberator. It wasn't built for high-altitude precision bombing. It was smaller, faster, and used for tactical strikes, bridges, railways, and enemy airfields. The Luftwaffe pilots thought they were dealing with an easy target, but appearances can be deceiving. The B-25 was rugged, agile, and deadly. It could take damage that would cripple most medium bombers and still bring its crew home. And when those first formations appeared over the front lines in 1943, flown by fresh American crews eager to prove themselves, the Luftwaffe soon realized that this new intruder wasn't to be underestimated. Before we dive into the chaos of those encounters, you have to understand the mindset of the Luftwaffe at that time. In early 1943, they still ruled the skies over Europe. The Me-10-9s and FW-19s dominated airspace from France to the Eastern Front. American daylight bombing raids had begun, but they were limited, cautious, and small in scale. German aces like Walter Nowotny, Egon Meyer, and Adolf Galland had hundreds of kills between them. Their confidence was absolute. When they first received reports of small twin-engine bombers penetrating deep into occupied territory, they assumed it was a minor nuisance, nothing compared to the heavy bomber streams that required massive coordination to repel. 2 engines? One pilot scoffed in his post-war memoirs. We thought it was a reconnaissance plane. We were wrong. The first major engagement between the Luftwaffe and American B-25 squadrons occurred in the spring of 1943, during low-level attacks on rail lines and supply depots in northern France. The Luftwaffe scrambled a mix of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s to intercept. The German tactic was straightforward: hit the formation from the rear, where bombers were most vulnerable. But when they approached, something unexpected happened. The B-25s didn't scatter. They held formation, flying low and steady, and when the first German fighters closed in, the air erupted with machine gun fire. The B-25's defensive armament was astonishing for its size. Some versions carried up to 12.50 caliber guns, more firepower than most heavy bombers of the previous decade. Luftwaffe ace Dietrich Peltz described it in his combat report. They were like angry hornets. You come in from behind and suddenly you are flying through a storm of tracers. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from because every part of that aircraft seemed to be firing. The B-25's dorsal and tail turrets, combined with flexible waist guns, created overlapping fields of fire. Attacking one meant facing a curtain of lead that shredded wings and engines. German pilots, used to quick, clean kills against lightly armed reconnaissance planes, were caught completely off guard. And then there was the speed. The B-25 could fly over 270 miles per hour. Slow compared to a fighter, yes, but fast enough to make closing in difficult at low altitude. German pilots had to dive at high speeds to catch up, and many overshot their targets, exposing themselves to deadly crossfire. Luftwaffe records from early 1943 mention several aircraft lost due to collisions or structural failures during low-level intercepts against B-25 formations. "It was like chasing shadows," recalled one Me-109 pilot. "They flew so low that our engines started sucking in dust and debris when we tried to follow. It was suicide, but perhaps the biggest surprise came when Luftwaffe pilots saw what the B-25 could do offensively. By mid-1943, American squadrons had started experimenting with modified versions, some equipped with a 75mm cannon mounted in the nose, designed to destroy ships, trains, and fortified positions. When these gunships appeared over the Mediterranean and Western Europe, German ground troops initially thought they were under attack by artillery. The cannon could fire shells that tore through armored vehicles and anti-aircraft batteries alike. One German officer stationed near Brest wrote, "It was a bomber that fought like a tank. We could not believe it at first. The front of the aircraft flashed like a cannon, and trucks exploded in seconds." Luftwaffe fighters tasked with intercepting these cannon-equipped B-25s quickly learned that engaging from the front was suicide. A single hit from the 75mm could obliterate a fighter. Even the more common strafing variants of the B-25 carried up to 8 forward-firing machine guns, turning them into airborne gunships capable of destroying trains, convoys, and ships with terrifying precision. For the Luftwaffe, accustomed to bombers that needed fighter escort to survive, the idea of an American bomber that could both defend itself and strike offensively was deeply unsettling. The psychological shock began to spread. Intelligence briefings from the Luftwaffe's Western Command described the B-25 as highly resistant to damage, exceptionally armed, and capable of low-altitude precision attack. Pilots began requesting new tactics. Some refused to engage unless they had altitude advantage or numerical superiority. By the summer of 1943, the B-25s had gained a reputation, not for being the biggest or the fastest, but for being impossible to predict. They attacked at dawn, at dusk, sometimes at treetop level, vanishing into clouds or smoke after unleashing their payload. German pilots began calling them Die Fliegenden Jäger, the flying hunters. But what made the B-25 truly terrifying wasn't its guns or its armor, it was the men flying them. Most of the American crews were young, many barely out of flight school, yet they carried a fearless determination that the Luftwaffe couldn't ignore. They flew through flak, engine fires, and attacks from experienced German aces without breaking formation. German intelligence later concluded that these crews showed an unusual disregard for personal safety. To the Luftwaffe, that was incomprehensible. They flew as if they did not care whether they lived or died, one German ace admitted after the war. It was as if they had no fear of us at all. By late 1943, the B-25 was no longer an unknown intruder. It had become a constant presence across Europe. Luftwaffe commanders began referring to it in their tactical reports, trying to understand how such a mid-sized bomber was having such a disruptive effect on supply lines and coastal defenses. It wasn't just the aircraft's firepower, it was its adaptability. The Americans were using the B-25 in every conceivable way: low-level bombing runs, anti-ship strikes, ground support, even nighttime harassment missions. German pilots who once laughed at the medium bomber concept now spoke of it with a kind of reluctant awe. One ace, Hans Lutzow, described it as the mosquito that became a bear. You swat at it, but it keeps coming back angrier each time. When the Luftwaffe first faced coordinated B-25 raids escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts, it changed the dynamic entirely. German pilots were forced to split their focus between heavily armed bombers and aggressive American fighters diving in from above. Dogfights broke out while B-25 formations continued their runs undeterred. The Luftwaffe tried attacking from below, an old tactic used against Soviet bombers, but even that was risky. The Mitchell's belly guns and nose cannons meant that any approach angle could become fatal. In one engagement over the French coast, Oberleutnant Ernst Rupp's FW-190 was hit squarely in the engine by a B-25's nose gun burst. He bailed out and later admitted, "I underestimated them. I thought they were soft targets. They were not. What truly unsettled the Luftwaffe was the B-25's ability to strike and vanish. Unlike the massive bomber formations that crawled across radar screens, the Mitchells appeared and disappeared with surgical precision. They struck supply convoys one day and coastal batteries the next. Then they'd show up hundreds of miles away, targeting airfields or U-boats. German radar stations often couldn't track them properly because of their low altitude. The unpredictability created chaos across the Reich's defensive network. Every report of twin-engine bombers sighted sent fighters scrambling in every direction. And often, by the time they arrived, the B-25s were gone, replaced by smoking wreckage and burning rail cars below. In the Mediterranean theater, Luftwaffe units faced an even more terrifying reality. The B-25 squadrons operating there had perfected skip bombing, a tactic where bombs were dropped low and fast, skipping across the water to hit ships directly at the hull. German sailors began calling them the American torpedoes. In April 1943, during an attack on the port of Naples, a formation of B-25s under Major John Hennebury destroyed 5 cargo ships and 2 destroyers in under 10 minutes. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled too late, arriving only in time to see the sea littered with burning ships. "It was like they were ghosts," wrote one German observer. "They came out of nowhere, struck like thunder, and vanished into the horizon." That's when panic started to spread among Luftwaffe ground crews and pilots alike. Every encounter with the B-25 seemed to end the same way: unexpected, violent, and costly. By autumn, the German Air Command issued a formal directive warning pilots to avoid frontal attacks on B-25s at low altitude. The reason? Too many had been shot down attempting it. "The enemy's medium bomber is now as dangerous as any heavy," the report read. That was a stunning admission for a force that had prided itself on superiority. Even experienced German aces began expressing frustration. "We were trained to hunt bombers, not duel with them," recalled Heinz Baer. "But these Americans, they built bombers that could fight." And still, the B-25 evolved. Field modifications added more armor and more guns. The most famous of these, the B-25H, carried that monstrous 75mm cannon and 14 forward-firing machine guns. When Luftwaffe pilots first encountered it, they thought it was some kind of new American assault aircraft. There are reports of Me-110s turning away mid-attack after seeing the cannon flash from a Mitchell's nose. Luftwaffe intelligence analysts nicknamed it Panzerflugzeug, the armored aircraft. Some German pilots compared its firepower to that of a Stuka dive bomber, but in reverse. Instead of diving at its target, it came head-on, blasting through anything in its path. By early 1944, Luftwaffe leadership faced a grim realization. They could no longer maintain air superiority over key regions because of how the B-25s operated. These bombers weren't designed to win air battles. They were designed to grind down Germany's infrastructure, and they did it relentlessly. Every destroyed rail line, every bombed bridge, every supply depot meant one more step toward the collapse of German mobility. "We could shoot down 5 and 10 more would come back," said one weary pilot after the war. It was endless. But the psychological toll was just as severe. German propaganda had painted the Americans as inexperienced and clumsy compared to their elite pilots. The B-25 shattered that illusion. Stories circulated through Luftwaffe bases of Mitchell crews that flew home on one engine, or limped back to England with half their fuselage missing. There was one account of a B-25 returning after a mission with its tail nearly severed, held together by control cables, and sheer luck. "How do you fight an enemy who refuses to die?" asked a German commander in his after-action notes. "It's like shooting at machines built of courage." The Luftwaffe soon found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't play by the same rules. While German pilots focused on honor, formation, and tradition, the Americans emphasized aggression, adaptability, and sheer persistence. B-25 crews would fly again the very next day, repairing damage overnight, patching holes with tape and paint, ready for another run. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages and logistical collapse, couldn't match that tempo. Every loss hurt more. Every engagement drained them further. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots began dreading the mission briefings that included B-25 activity. It wasn't fear of the aircraft itself, it was what it represented. The B-25 symbolized an unstoppable enemy, an industrial giant whose factories could replace every loss tenfold. For every Mitchell shot down, 2 more seemed to take its place. One German ace summed it up best. "When we faced the B-25, we realized we were not fighting men anymore. We were fighting an entire nation." By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was in freefall. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified to a level the Germans could barely comprehend, and the B-25 was now a fixture in nearly every frontline operation. In Western Europe, North Africa, Italy, and the Balkans, Mitchell's squadrons were hammering German troop concentrations, bridges, and supply trains with relentless precision. They weren't just supporting the strategic bombing effort, they were dismantling the German war machine piece by piece. Every destroyed train meant fewer reinforcements to Normandy. Every shattered bridge slowed the retreat from Italy, and every daylight raid that went unchallenged chipped away at the Luftwaffe's confidence. When Luftwaffe pilots first faced American B-25s in 1943, they'd laughed. By 1944, they were praying they wouldn't see them. The B-25 had earned a fearsome reputation among fighter units. It was fast enough to evade, tough enough to survive, and armed well enough to fight back. German pilots began describing it as the stubborn one. The aircraft simply refused to die. Even when hit by cannon fire, Mitchells often made it back to base trailing smoke, with engines torn apart and holes in the wings large enough to crawl through. You could empty your guns into one and it would still fly. One Luftwaffe ace wrote bitterly after the war. "We started calling them flying tanks." The Luftwaffe's own aircraft, meanwhile, were becoming fragile and scarce. Shortages of fuel and spare parts meant that veteran pilots were often grounded while inexperienced recruits filled the skies. The average new German pilot in 1944 had less than 50 hours of total flight time. Many had never fired their weapons in live combat before being thrown against American formations. The results were devastating. "They were lambs," recalled one surviving officer. "The Americans had training. We had desperation." And when those green pilots met squadrons of battle-hardened B-25 crews, the outcome was all but predetermined. Few came back. American airmen noticed it too. One B-25 navigator remembered seeing German attacks lose cohesion halfway through an intercept. They'd come in fast, maybe get one burst off, and then break away. You could tell they didn't want to be there. The aura of invincibility that once surrounded the Luftwaffe was gone. Even when the Germans scored kills, the losses they took in return were catastrophic. The B-25s operated in tight formations, overlapping their fields of fire, creating what one German observer called a moving fortress wall. Getting close enough to hit one meant flying through a storm of bullets. Few pilots dared try twice. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting on too many fronts to recover. In Italy, the German retreat northward was constantly harassed by waves of Mitchells. They bombed columns, strafed roads, and ambushed retreating convoys with terrifying precision. In France, B-25s were part of Operation Cobra, the breakout after D-Day, obliterating German positions that stood in the Allies' path. Luftwaffe squadrons sent to intercept them found themselves facing not only the bombers, but a sky full of American fighters. The B-25 had become more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of Allied dominance. Even veteran German pilots, men who had fought since the early days of the war, began to realize that there was no longer any hope of victory. Many Luftwaffe units adopted new tactics to simply survive. They would avoid confrontation unless the bombers were unescorted or vulnerable. Some even began using radio deception to mislead Allied squadrons into chasing phantom formations. But none of it worked for long. The Americans always came back. "It was like trying to fight the tide," said one German commander. "You could resist for a moment, but it always returned, stronger than before." By late 1944, reports from Luftwaffe air intelligence painted a grim picture. The B-25s were now operating with near impunity. Airfields in the Netherlands and Western Germany were bombed repeatedly. Trains and depots that escaped one raid were destroyed in the next. In some areas, German troops began calling them Tagjäger, day hunters, because they seemed to prowl the skies whenever the sun was up. One report from a field headquarters near Aachen read simply, "Movement by day is no longer possible." And then came the final blow. As winter set in and the Allies pushed closer to the German border, B-25 squadrons joined in the destruction of the Rhine bridges, the last escape routes for retreating German forces. These low-level attacks, often carried out under intense anti-aircraft fire, were some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Yet the crews flew them again and again. Luftwaffe pilots, already outnumbered and outgunned, could do little but watch. One recalled flying above the burning wreckage of Cologne and seeing dozens of B-25s diving through smoke and flak. "They looked like silver arrows," he said. "We could not stop them. We could only witness." When historians talk about the destruction of the Luftwaffe, they often focus on the P-51 Mustang and the B-17 Flying Fortress, and rightly so. But among German veterans, the aircraft that haunted them most was often the B-25. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the biggest, but it was relentless. It represented the grinding inevitability of the Allied advance, the kind of war Germany could not win. As Luftwaffe ace Heinz Knoke wrote years later, "The B-25 symbolized everything we feared about the Americans. They were not fighting for glory or fame. They fought to finish the job, and they never stopped coming." To the men who faced it, The B-25 was not just an airplane, it was a message, a declaration that the era of Luftwaffe supremacy was over, and no matter how brave or skilled Germany's pilots were, no one could fight against an enemy with endless resources, unshakable resolve, and machines built to endure the impossible. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe was little more than a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, bombed-out airfields, and the constant pressure of Allied raids had shattered what was once the most feared air force in the world. Yet, even as Germany's defenses crumbled, the B-25 kept coming. Across occupied Europe, its distinctive twin engines became the soundtrack of defeat. To the soldiers on the ground, the whine of its approach meant destruction. To Luftwaffe pilots, it meant frustration, futility, and the creeping realization that the war was slipping from their grasp. In the West, B-25 units were now operating in relentless coordination with ground forces, striking ahead of advancing Allied armor. They targeted bridges, choke points, and troop concentrations with precision that stunned German commanders. The Luftwaffe's remaining fighter wings tried to respond, but they were stretched to breaking point. Every time we launched, the fuel gauges already frightened us, one pilot remembered. We had maybe 30 minutes to fight before turning back. The B-25s exploited this weakness mercilessly. Flying in from well-supplied bases in liberated France or Italy, they could loiter over the battlefield long after German fighters had withdrawn. When the Me-10-9s and FW-19s disappeared, the B-25s would return to finish the job. For many German airmen, the first sight of those formations in 1943 had inspired confidence. They were sure that two-engine bombers would be easy prey. But by 1945, that confidence was gone. The psychological shift was total. A Luftwaffe after-action report from March described the B-25 as an enemy aircraft that combines the persistence of the heavy bomber with the agility of a fighter. It was the worst of both worlds for German pilots. They could not outlast them in endurance, nor could they overwhelm them with numbers. When an intercept was ordered, most German squadrons launched, knowing they were already outmatched. As the Allies crossed the Rhine, B-25 crews were assigned to cut off every supply and communication line left to the German army. They destroyed convoys in daylight, hammered bridges at night, and obliterated retreating columns on the autobahns. Luftwaffe pilots tasked with covering those ground units described scenes of chaos. "You could not protect anything," recalled one officer. "They came in waves. We were too few, too low on ammunition, too late." He admitted that sometimes they didn't even try to engage. Instead, they flew patrols above the smoke just to witness the inevitable destruction from afar. But the final blow to Luftwaffe morale wasn't just the damage the B-25 inflicted, it was the ease with which it did so. These aircraft seemed endless. Every airfield the Germans bombed would be operational again within hours. Every Mitchell they shot down was replaced by another the next day. It was an industrial nightmare. German mechanics were scavenging for parts from wrecked aircraft, while American factories were producing hundreds more each month. One Luftwaffe logistics officer summarized it bluntly: "For every bomber we destroy, America builds 5 more. We are not fighting an air force, we are fighting a factory." Even in the last desperate months of the war, when Germany began deploying jet fighters like the Me-262, the B-25 still found ways to survive. The jets were fast, but they were few and plagued by mechanical issues. The Mitchells adapted by flying lower and faster, hugging terrain, and timing their strikes to minimize detection. Many Luftwaffe jet pilots complained that they rarely caught sight of them until it was too late. "They appeared below the horizon like ghosts," said one jet ace, By the time you dove, they were gone. As the Reich collapsed, the remaining Luftwaffe veterans could only watch as the Allies advanced. Entire squadrons of B-25s flew overhead in formation, heading deeper into German territory. For some pilots, those final days felt surreal. They had spent years believing they ruled the skies, only to see American bombers, once dismissed as second-rate, flying freely above their homeland. It was humiliation, wrote ace Karl Boris after the war, to see them unopposed, circling our cities, bombing our bridges, as if we no longer existed. When the fighting finally stopped, those who survived began to reflect. In post-war interviews and memoirs, Luftwaffe aces were strikingly honest about their impressions of the B-25. Many admitted they had underestimated it from the start. They'd expected it to be another fragile medium bomber, easily picked off by faster fighters. Instead, they found a machine that was rugged, adaptable, and terrifyingly persistent. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected generals, said bluntly, "It was not the biggest bomber that broke us. It was the one that never stopped showing up." He compared the B-25 to a hammer that never tired, always finding a new target. What made the Mitchell so effective wasn't just its design, it was how the Americans used it. They didn't rely on massive, slow-moving fleets like the British or Germans had. They turned the B-25 into a tactical weapon, a precision tool that could appear anywhere at any time. It wasn't about shock and awe, it was about persistence and precision. For the Luftwaffe, that unpredictability was devastating. Every airfield, every convoy, every stretch of railway became vulnerable. There was no safety anywhere. And perhaps that was the most demoralizing lesson of all. The German airmen who had once believed in their invincibility were forced to accept that courage and skill could not compensate for exhaustion and industrial inferiority. "We were outflown, outbuilt, and outlasted," one veteran said decades later. The B-25 showed us that war is not won by heroes. It is won by those who keep coming back. By the time the war ended, Luftwaffe pilots no longer mocked the Mitchell. They respected it, they feared it, and they remembered it. To them, the sound of those twin engines symbolized the slow, inevitable collapse of everything they had fought for. The B-25 wasn't just another bomber. It was the echo of a world ending. In the years following the war, as both Allied and German veterans began sharing their stories, the reputation of the B-25 Mitchell only grew. Historians, engineers, and pilots alike agreed that it had been one of the most versatile and effective aircraft of the entire conflict. Yet what made its story so compelling wasn't just its technical achievement, it was the respect it earned from the very enemies who tried to destroy it. Luftwaffe aces, who had once dismissed American bombers as clumsy and slow, found themselves admiring the Mitchell for its balance of speed, firepower, and survivability. It had become a symbol of everything the Allied war machine represented: persistence, adaptability, and overwhelming determination. Adolf Galland, the famous German fighter commander, once reflected that the Luftwaffe had never been prepared for an opponent capable of such relentless production and innovation. "The Americans fought a war of machines," he said, "and the B-25 was the perfect machine for their kind of war, fast enough to strike, strong enough to survive, and built in such numbers that defeat was only a matter of time." His words echoed a sentiment shared by many of his contemporaries. They hadn't been beaten solely by superior technology or tactics. They'd been beaten by endurance. Every time a German pilot downed a Mitchell, 10 more filled the skies. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep up. After 1945, captured Luftwaffe officers often spoke with surprising admiration for the B-25. In debriefings, they noted its incredible ability to absorb punishment and continue flying. Some even compared it favorably to their own Ju-88, a bomber they once considered unmatched. The Ju-88 was elegant, one German engineer said. The B-25 was brutal. It was a boxer, not a dancer, but in the end the boxer always wins. This honesty came not from bitterness, but from professional respect. These men had seen firsthand what the B-25 could do. They'd watched it turn rail yards into infernos, seen it rip through convoys, and witnessed entire battalions scatter at the sound of its engines. It had earned its place in their memories. The psychological effect it had on the Luftwaffe's pilots lasted far beyond the war. Many of them admitted that after 1944, the mere sight of a twin-engine formation approaching on the horizon was enough to tighten their chests. They no longer saw easy targets. They saw death in formation. One pilot wrote, "It was not the fear of dying, it was the certainty of it." When we faced the B-25, we knew the odds were against us before we even took off. That sense of inevitability eroded morale faster than any bullet could. The Luftwaffe was built on confidence and dominance, but the B-25 stripped both away. What makes the story even more remarkable is how the B-25's legacy continued long after the guns fell silent. Thousands of Mitchells survived the war, serving in dozens of air forces around the world for decades. They flew in Korea, in Indonesia, in South America, anywhere there was a need for a reliable, battle-tested aircraft. Some were converted into transports, others into training planes or reconnaissance platforms. But for those who remembered Europe's skies during the 1940s, the B-25 would forever be linked to that defining moment when German pilots first realized the war had turned against them. It wasn't just a bomber. It was a warning that the old world, the world of chivalric dogfights and tactical duels, was over. Industrialized air war had arrived, and there was no turning back. From the perspective of the Luftwaffe, facing the B-25 for the first time was a shock. By the end, it was a nightmare. But in defeat, they also recognized something universal. The aircraft embodied the human qualities that ultimately decide wars: discipline, endurance, and courage under pressure. Even in German memoirs written decades later, that respect remained. "We learned to hate the sound of those engines," said ace Franz Stiegler, "but we also learned to admire the men who flew them. They were brave, and their aircraft was perfect for them." Today, surviving B-25s are cherished museum pieces, polished and restored, their propellers still echoing faintly with the voices of the past. Visitors see gleaming aluminum, neat rows of rivets, and the iconic glass nose. What they can't see are the stories etched into every dented panel and patched wing, the nights over France, the chases through smoke-filled valleys, the moments when Luftwaffe pilots realized they were no longer hunters, but hunted. For those who lived it, the B-25 wasn't just an airplane, it was the sound of inevitability. And that's the truth about when Luftwaffe pilots first faced America's B-25 Mitchell. They expected an easy victory. What they got instead was a relentless opponent that refused to yield. The Mitchell wasn't the largest or the most famous bomber of World War II, but it was the one that changed minds, broke morale, and forced even Germany's best pilots to acknowledge that the skies no longer belonged to them. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to hit that like button. It helps this channel reach more history enthusiasts like you. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the untold moments of World War II aviation, from the duel between Mustangs and Messerschmitts to the last stand of the Luftwaffe jets over Berlin. I'd love to hear from you too. Did someone in your family serve during the war? Maybe a pilot, mechanic, or gunner? Share their story in the comments below. Every one of those memories keeps this history alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.